All right, let's jump right in. We tend to think of science as this, straight line, one discovery building neatly on the next. But what if I told you some of the biggest ideas in science were figured out, then totally lost for 2,000 years, only to be rediscovered? Yeah, this is the story of a lost millennium of scientific thought.
I mean, that's a pretty bold statement, right? It sets up this incredible mystery. Who were these ancient thinkers who were just so far ahead of their time? And maybe even more important, who were the two famous philosophers that supposedly slammed the brakes on science for 2 millennia? That's the story we're going to unpack.
So, to really get how this all went down, we've got to go way back in time. We're talking about a 2,000-year detour. A detour that pretty much shaped the entire world we live in today.
When you hear ancient Greece, your mind probably jumps to guys like Plato, Aristotle, the Parthenon, right? But we're going to a time before all that, to an era that was just buzzing with these radical, challenging, and honestly, super modern ideas about what the universe is actually made of.
So, this era? It was all about a group of thinkers we now call the pre-Socratics. And their approach was revolutionary. I mean, instead of explaining the world with gods and myths, they looked for answers in the natural world itself. The answers, they figured, were in the stuff all around them.
Okay, just take a look at this concept from Leucippus and Democritus, atomism. The idea that everything, you, me, the screen you're watching at, is made of tiny, indivisible particles just zipping around in empty space. They came up with this in the 5th century BCE. That is the literal foundation of modern chemistry and physics, and these guys were already there. It's wild.
And it gets even wilder. A century before that, a philosopher named Anaximander suggested that life wasn't just created the way it is now, but that it evolved. He even went so far as to propose that humans came from some kind of fish-like creature that learned to live on land. We're talking more than 2,000 years before Charles Darwin. That is just staggering. Absolutely staggering. So how in the world did they come up with these unbelievable ideas? Well, through empiricism. Basically, the belief that knowledge comes from looking, from observing, from gathering actual evidence. You had thinkers like Xenophanes, who would study fossils of sea creatures found way up on mountains and say, hey, this means the Earth has a deep, dramatic history, which, flew in the face of all the myths of their time. So you put all this together, and what do you get? A totally revolutionary worldview. A bottom-up way of understanding reality. The universe isn't some mystical place run by gods, it's a physical system, a system we can actually figure out just by looking at it. And if that sounds familiar, it should. That's the very heart of modern science.
But this whole vibrant materialist way of thinking, it was on a collision course with a massive turning point. And that turning point came in the form of 2 of the most influential minds in human history, Plato and his student Aristotle. And believe me, they were about to change everything.
And this is where you can really see the 2 worldviews clash. On one side, you've got the pre-Socratics we've been talking about. On the other, something completely different. For Plato and Aristotle, true knowledge didn't come from the messy, physical world around us. Nope, it came from pure logic and reason. Atoms? No way. They believed in perfect, ideal forms. Evolution? Impossible. To them, species were eternal, fixed, unchanging. The core of this whole thing was Plato's theory of forms. He argued that the physical world we see and touch is just a flawed, imperfect shadow of a higher reality, a perfect, eternal, unchanging world of forms. So his thinking was, why would you waste your time studying a shadow? The real truth, he believed, could only be found through your mind, through pure logic. And then along comes Aristotle. Now, he was a brilliant observer of nature, for sure, but he used that towering intellect to just systematically tear down the pre-Socratic ideas. He argued there was no void or empty space for atoms to move in. He completely denied evolution, creating this detailed classification of life where every single species was locked in its place, eternal and unchanging. He basically built a complete logical system that explained everything. And in that system, there was just no room for ideas like atoms or evolution. So what happens when the ideas of Plato and Aristotle become the main events, the dominant way of thinking in the Western world? Well, the consequence was this: great reversal, a long, profound silence on these other ideas. Okay, and this is so crucial to understand. History isn't just about who has the best ideas. It's about whose books actually survive. The works of Plato and Aristotle, they were treated like gold, copied by scribes, studied in universities, preserved for centuries. But the writings of Democritus, Anaximander, and the others? Poof! Most of them just vanished, lost to fires, floods, or just, the simple passage of time.
The result? 2,000 years. Just let that sink in. For 2 millennia, the investigation into what matter is made of and where life comes from was basically put on hold. The conversation just died.
And this timeline, man, it just lays it all out. You see atomism pop up in the 5th century BCE, then Aristotle rejects it, and then nothing. A huge empty chasm of time until it's rediscovered around 1650. And it's the exact same story for evolution. It's like a historical echo across this immense silent gap.
So all of this, it forces us to ask one of history's greatest what-ifs. And it also makes us completely rethink one of the most important moments in human history, the scientific revolution.
It gives us a totally new way to look at it. Okay, so step 1, you have this initial spark of materialist science in ancient Greece. Step 2, the huge detour where idealism takes over for 2,000 years. Step 3, the big comeback, the beginning of the scientific revolution. And step 4, and this is the real kicker, is realizing that many of its groundbreaking discoveries were actually rediscoveries.
So here's the big idea, the main takeaway from all this. We're often taught that the scientific revolution was this brand new beginning, a sudden dawn of reason out of nowhere. But maybe it's better to think of it as a reconnection. Humanity finally picking up the thread of a conversation that had been dropped and left sitting there for 2,000 years.
And that leaves us with this final, really powerful question to think about. How different would our world be today if that 2,000-year detour had never happened? What if the observational materialist science of those first thinkers had just kept going, kept developing? What would we know now? Where would we be? It's impossible to know, of course, but it's a fascinating and honestly a pretty humbling thought.